Taehyung wasn't supposed to cry that night. The studio lights were set for shimmer, glamour, celebration, another national late-night appearance where BTS would reflect on their decade-long journey, laugh at nostalgic moments, tease each other over old trainee stories, and remind the world why they became Korea's biggest pride. The host's questions were safe, soft, predictable. The set was polished with gold accents, a giant LED wall showing BTS milestones, a crowd of hand-picked studio guests holding purple lightsticks, producers smiling in the control room, confident they were filming television history of the wholesome kind. No one expected history to take a sharp turn into something rawer, something louder, something unscripted. It started with a subtle beat of silence, the kind that lasts just a second too long to be casual. The host mentioned a name without weight, without dramatics, almost like it was an unimportant passing detail. Bang Si-hyuk, Bang PD, the father figure of HYBE, the man who had mentored them from cramped rehearsal rooms to stadium roars. But when the name hit Taehyung's ears, his expression shifted, not explosive, not immediate, just a drop in his gaze, shoulders tightening like a storm quietly gathering behind calm skis. The members beside him noticed. Jungkook in this universe of the narrative tilted his head slightly, trying to decode the sudden temperature change in the room. The audience felt it too, though they didn't know why yet. They thought it was sentimental reflection loading. They didn't know it was emotional overload arriving. Then came the question, gentle, dangerous in its softness. Taehyung, you've been quieter than usual tonight. Is there something you want to say to Bang PD? The room inhaled. Not as a gasp, but as a collective intake of breath, sensing something was about to tilt. Taehyung didn't answer with a smile. He answered with movement. He stood up from the couch, reached behind his ear, pulled out his in-ear monitor and placed it down slowly on the seat, severing the invisible cord that usually filtered every sentence an idol sends into a live feed. The producers in the control room froze, not because they planned to, but because no one dared to interrupt yet. Fingers hovered over the switch to cut the broadcast, but no one pressed it. Not yet. Taehyung walked to the edge of the stage, every step deliberate, like someone crossing into a moment he had mentally rehearsed for years but never verbally scripted. He gripped the microphone in a hand that shook, not from weakness, but from emotional pressure finally refusing containment. His voice cracked the moment it left his lips. Bang Si-hyuk. He said the name like a personal summons delivered through the veins of national television. You told me we were family. You told me you protect us. You told me I had a voice. The audience blinked, confused, then stunned. I remember that night in 2018. I was tired, invisible. I wanted to walk away. You told me I mattered. You told me I was more than a performer, more than a visual, more than a dancer. You told me I was an artist, and I believed you. The silence in the studio thickened, not awkward but sacred, heavy, like everyone present realized they were no longer watching a segment. They were witnessing an eruption. Somewhere along the journey, he continued, tears spilling without choreography, you stopped seeing me in the rooms where decisions were made. I heard about tour extensions from staff, not leadership. When my father was in the hospital, your silence felt like distance, not strategy. Jungkook's face paled in the background. He knew the Taehyung he grew up with, the gentle one, the poetic one, the quietly resilient one. But this Taehyung was louder, sharper, realer. I stayed loyal. I loved BTS more than myself sometimes. I don't regret love. I regret silence. I don't want meetings. I want truth. Why did you stop seeing me? His voice wasn't asking for national attention. It was demanding personal closure in a world that was never built for personal closure to go live. The cameras stayed rolling because no one dared stop them. This wasn't a confession written for applause. It was a confrontation written by exhaustion, loyalty, betrayal, and long-held emotional debt that finally asked to be paid in honesty instead of compliance. The moment he walked off stage, there was no cue, no music, no transition graphic, no commercial, just a nation left to stare at unresolved truth. Jungkook was the first to move, sprinting backstage without caring about the broadcast still glued to Taehyung's retreating back. The rest of the members sat frozen, realizing something far deeper than nostalgia had been brewing under Taehyung's practiced calm. The internet erupted not with mockery but heartbreak. Millions clipped his speech, translated it, resurfaced archival interviews, stitched emotional breadcrumbs the world had ignored until now. And minutes later, Bang Si-hyuk responded personally in a home studio livestream, his voice soft, face pale, admitting only one sentence. "I should have known. I failed you." But Taehyung didn't check trending that night. For the first time, he spoke for the boy who used to dance in mirrors hoping someone would believe in him when the lights were off. And belief finally came, not from one man, but from millions who realized that sometimes a voice doesn't need polish to move a nation. It only needs courage to finally refuse silence. Taehyung didn't remember sitting down. One moment he was standing backstage gripping the mic like it was a lifeline. The next he was on the floor of the dressing room, knees folded up to his chest, breath jagged, chest rising and falling like a man who had sprinted miles without moving an inch. The door was shut, but the sound leaked through anyway, quiet sobs turning heavier, each one layered with the emotional backlog of a decade. The makeup on his face had streaked down like watercolor caught in rain, not dramatic by choice, dramatic by truth finally refusing containment. He wiped at his cheeks angrily, almost frustrated at the betrayal of his own body. He didn't want to cry again. Not here, not now. But crying was no longer optional. It had gone past optional hours ago. Outside, Jungkook in this universe of the narrative was leaning against the hallway wall. His back pressed to the cold plaster, hoodie damp from December mist, eyes shut, jaw tight, fists clenched at his sides like someone trying to hold back a second explosion. He had heard Taehyung say Bang PD's name on live television. He had seen the moment shift from nostalgia to fracture. But what he was seeing now, the aftermath, was bigger than a broadcast segment, bigger than a viral moment, bigger than idle personas. This was brotherhood colliding with corporate power, emotional debt colliding with strategic silence, humanity colliding with a machine that had forgotten it was built by humans in the first place. A gentle knock came first, then another. Producers were packing in the distance. Staff whispered in clusters, unsure if they were supposed to step in or stay out. The hallway felt like a fault line too, split between intervention and respect, between panic and paralysis. But Jungkook didn't wait for any of them. He knocked again, softer this time, voice low but resolute. Hyung opened the door. Taehyung didn't answer. He couldn't, not yet. His breath caught once more as another wave hit, heavier than the last. A reminder that emotional honesty was messy not because it was weak, but because it was long overdue. He stood slowly, steps tired, each one hesitant not from regret, but from exhaustion so deep even breathing felt like rebellion. He unlocked the door, slowly, barely an inch at first, but that inch was enough. Jungkook stepped in immediately, closing the door behind him without waiting for permission, like someone sealing a room against a world that didn't deserve front row access yet. Taehyung turned away, embarrassed almost, still gripping the mic. "You shouldn't have said all that," Jungkook murmured, not angry, not accusatory, just stunned at the scale. "I had to," Taehyung whispered back. Jungkook paced again, running a hand through damp hair, voice rising slightly now. "You could have told me, you could have told us." Taehyung finally turned to him, eyes red but sharp now, sincerity turning into something harder. "You think I didn't try? Every time I brought it up it was brushed off. By him, by staff, by everyone, even by the world when it was still busy cheering." Jungkook froze mid-pace. The words landed like a second monologue, but quieter, sharper, heavier. Because this monologue wasn't for millions. It was for one person who mattered in a room where the cameras were finally off. "You hid it so well," Jungkook said softly. "Because I thought I had to protect BTS," Taehyung replied, voice cracked again. But not from sadness this time. This crack had the tone of a man dismantling an illusion brick by brick. "I thought if I made noise, they'd call me ungrateful, that I'd fracture the group, that I'd look like the villain of my own family story." Jungkook stepped forward, fury melting into guilt, guilt melting into something protective again. He sat down beside him, the room suddenly smaller than the world outside it. "Was that why you almost left in 2021?" he asked quietly. Taehyung let out a hollow laugh, bitter not theatrical. "Handled," he mimicked, shaking his head slightly. "That's what Namjoon said, like I was a fire to be contained, not a person to be heard." Jungkook didn't defend Namjoon. He couldn't. Because the truth of this universe was already standing in the room between them, impossible to unhear now. The air turned suffocating for a beat before Taehyung inhaled again, voice softer but sincere. "I was proud of you, I still am, but I didn't want to weigh you down with my darkness." Jungkook shook his head immediately. "You are not a burden, you never were." Taehyung closed his eyes again, leaning his head back, letting the sentence sit in the silence like a treaty quietly being drafted in air, not paper. "No one ever thinks they have to fight for someone until it's almost too late," he murmured. "And I didn't want it to be too late for BTS." The silence inside the dressing room was interrupted only by a vibration. Not applause, not trending notifications. A call. Jungkook reached for the phone, saw the name, eyes widening. It wasn't a saved contact, but it didn't need to be. They both knew. Bang Si-hyuk had been watching live. And now he was calling live too, but privately, corporate power stripped away by a direct dial into a dressing room where one trembling voice had finally stopped choosing silence. And that call was about to shift the entire axis of their world again, not because it was viral, but because it was personal overdue, and answered in the only currency Taehyung had left to give without losing himself: honesty. Taehyung walked into the conference room like someone entering a storm that had already arrived. The glass walls were built to show transparency, but tonight they felt like an exhibit. Staff members outside were whispering, executives packing, assistants scrolling phones so fast their thumbs blurred into reflex. The atmosphere was louder than any stadium crowd BTS had ever performed for, yet colder, sterile, calculated. A single tablet sat in the center of the table, paused on the video of Bang Si-hyuk's apology livestream. The image was meant to look sincere. No makeup, no PR team, no polished lighting, just a man facing consequences. But Taehyung didn't touch it. He couldn't. He didn't want to see spin. He wanted to see sincerity without production. The tablet stayed untouched, glowing quietly like a lighthouse signaling a shore he no longer trusted. Jungkook in this universe stood beside him, protective not performative, eyes sharp, posture tense. He wasn't packing now. His packing had turned into presence. "They're rewriting everything," he said quietly, voice controlled but strained. "Look at the headlines." He didn't need to read them out loud. They were already everywhere. K-pop news outlets, international blogs, social platforms, even mainstream business channels were covering it. Not just the confession, not just the emotion. The corporate impact. Reporters were calling it a stunt. Others called it betrayal. Some claimed sabotage. Some blamed ego. Everyone wanted a villain, and villains were easier to sell than systems. Systems were harder to summarize, harder to tweet, harder to clip. So the world clipped villains instead. Taehyung exhaled once, tired. "Of course they are." Jungkook stared at him, stunned. "You don't care?" Taehyung looked up slowly, voice calm but weathered. "I care about being heard. I stopped caring about being framed." The room seemed to inhale too, even though there was no audience, because every person in that room had expected heartbreak, not detachment. "You deserve clarity," Jungkook said. "I deserve humanity," Taehyung replied. "Clarity is the world's obsession. Humanity is mine." He sat down at the long table, hoodie still on, mask removed now, face streaked not with shame but fatigue. Emotional fatigue so deep even breathing felt defiant. He placed the mic down in front of him finally, not gripping it now, releasing it like someone putting a sword down, not in surrender but strategy. The mic wasn't a lifeline anymore. It was a declaration that his voice didn't need to hide in melodies alone. It could stand in sentences too, even if sentences were dangerous. Jungkook sat across from him. "You hit it so well," he repeated, softer this time. "Because hiding was survival training," Taehyung said. "HYBE taught metrics, the world taught optics, BTS taught loyalty, but no one taught me how to stop disappearing quietly when loyalty demanded silence." Jungkook flinched again, guilt landing like a bruise. "We would have stood beside you." Taehyung shook his head. But you didn't see me sinking, you saw me smiling. The world always rewards smiles that bleed silently behind them. Then Namjoon in this universe entered, closing the door behind him quietly like someone sealing a room against judgment. He didn't look triumphant either. None of them did. This wasn't a victory hall, this was a reckoning chamber. I watched it, he said softly. I've been in my car for an hour trying to decode what the hell to say. Taehyung didn't look at him at first. Shame didn't live here, disappointment did. You don't need to say anything. No, Namjoon replied. I do. He stepped closer. You were right. I thought keeping the machine running meant leadership. But leadership isn't motion. It's awareness. And I ignored the cracks until they broke on national television. Taehyung finally met his eyes. The silence between them was older than BTS, older than contracts, older than fame. It was the silence of men who had built something massive together but never imagined the foundation would ask them questions back. You told me I was imagining it, Taehyung said quietly. Namjoon swallowed hard. Because admitting your pain meant admitting my complicity, and complicity is a heavier shame than backlash. Before Taehyung could respond, the door opened again, loud, abrupt, unfiltered. It was Taehyung himself, Taehyung in this narrative universe, storming in, phone slammed onto the table, anger molten. Look what they uploaded. A new HYBE PR video, behind-the-scenes piano shots, soft music, montage of early days, redemption arc packaging at its cinematic peak. Taehyung scoffed. They're turning this into a hero story for him, Jungkook whispered. This is disgusting. Namjoon cursed quietly. Taehyung just stared at the screen. Of course they are. Taehyung blinked at him, anger melting into confusion. Say something. Taehyung shook his head slowly. No, I'm not here to edit narratives, I'm here to destroy silence. Taehyung sat down beside him, stunned. You're insane. Awake, Taehyung corrected. I stopped caring about villain labels the moment silence labeled me invisible, Namjoon sighed. Then we asked the real question. He looked at Taehyung directly. Do you still want to be BTS? Taehyung didn't answer immediately. The silence stretched, not awkward, ceremonial. Finally, he looked up. I never stopped being BTS. I refuse to be a version of BTS that bleeds quietly while metrics applaud. The van ride through Seoul felt unreal, like the city outside had become a character in its own broadcast drama. Taehyung sat in the backseat, hoodie pulled low earlier, but now the hood rested behind his neck, shoulders slumped not from surrender but emotional depletion. The confession had drained him more than any choreography rehearsal ever had. Taehyung was already inside the van when they entered, scrolling social feeds at a speed that looked borderline dangerous. The glow of his phone reflected off his face like cold blue flame. They're twisting everything, Taehyung muttered, calling it sabotage, calling it a stunt, calling it betrayal. Jungkook climbed into the seat across from Taehyung, slamming the door shut a little harder than intended. The thud echoed like punctuation. Taehyung exhaled slowly. Of course they are. Taehyung blinked at him. You're not angry. I was angry for 10 years, Taehyung replied. I'm tired now. The van moved. Outside, camera crews were already gathering at the HYBE building entrance like sharks circling a narrative wound. Vans from every major network blocked alleys and curbs. Reporters yelled into mics, analysts speculated on panels, headlines rewrote themselves faster than facts could settle. Jungkook leaned forward. You deserve clarity, you deserve defense, you deserve the world hearing you without distortion. Taehyung shook his head. I deserve peace. The world deserves clarity. Those are different debts. Namjoon in this narrative universe, sat beside Jungkook in the van, face pale, eyes reflecting moral calculation and guilt he wasn't hiding anymore. I was scared, Namjoon said quietly, as if finishing a sentence he started hours ago. Scared that if I acknowledged your pain, I'd have to acknowledge my part in letting it fester, Taehyung scoffed. We all played our parts in the silence show. HYBE played the director. Namjoon didn't argue. He opened his laptop, already pulling archived media drafts. We need neutral ground, somewhere they can't interfere. We're already in the interference, Taehyung said. The world is interference when truth goes live. They didn't go home. They didn't go to HYBE HQ. They went up, higher than optics, higher than conglomerates. A private rooftop studio owned by an independent videographer who had worked with BTS during debut days. No surveillance, no staff committees, no approved talking points. Just a couch, a tripod, a mic, and December wind humming like ambient truth. Taehyung set the mic levels. Jungkook adjusted the frame. Namjoon prepared nothing but presence. Taehyung sat in the center, eyes red but unguarded, heartbeat pounding in his chest like a silent metronome counting down not music, but resolve. "Go live," he said. The world obeyed faster than HYBE ever had. 2 million viewers joined within 90 seconds. No broadcast cue, no national network bumpers, just global shock meeting raw honesty in real time. Taehyung leaned forward, lips trembling slightly, but his voice landed steady. "I'm not here to attack anyone. I'm here because silence attacked me first." The comments exploded in every language, not choreographed either, but chaotic heartbreak. Fans begged him to stop, begged him to speak, begged him to rest, begged for justice. Begging was the new chorus. Then a vibration, a call. Jungkook glanced at the screen and froze. The name was there again. Bang Si-hyuk, Bangi Hayak in the narrative alias universe. The man who had been the catalyst, now dialing privately into a live-stream truth chamber he hadn't authorized. "It's him," Jungkook whispered. Taehyung took the phone slowly. "Contracts are paper, family is voice, and voices don't trend, they erupt," he answered. "Bang PD." The voice on the other end was calm, controlled, colder than the December outside them. "You've made your point, now stop." "No," Taehyung whispered. "Now I finally started." Bang PD warned about contracts, consequences, clauses, expansion projects, PR leverage, shareholder impacts, national reputation, everything that could be weaponized legally. Taehyung responded with one sentence that tilted the moral axis again. "Then rip the contract." He ended the call. The internet wasn't just loud anymore. It was emotional infrastructure collapsing and rebuilding itself in real time. Clips from the rooftop livestream were spreading faster than subtitles could even be written. International broadcasters, radio hosts, business analysts, and social commentators were all parachuting into the story, trying to own a piece of the emotional explosion. But Taehyung wasn't watching the feeds. He was watching people, real people. The staff who used to avert their eyes when emotions ran high, now sitting in silence around a screen they didn't dare narrate over anymore. The executives who had memorized profit curves but never learned grief curves, now realizing grief had no algorithm to negotiate with. An army who had never needed instructions to mobilize, now mobilizing without needing leadership from anyone except their own loyalty. Taehyung leaned back into the couch, exhaustion heavy but purpose heavier. The mic in front of him was no longer a tool. It had become a witness. Taehyung sat on the floor beside the tripod, arms crossed, face a mixture of disbelief and reluctant admiration. Jungkook was near the railing, December wind catching his hair like a natural diffusion filter no studio light could replicate. Namjoon remained standing, laptop closed now, because preparation had turned into presence, and presence had become the only strategy left that mattered. Taehyung spoke without needing a cue. "They want me to shout, they want me to collapse, they want me to apologize for being honest, but honesty isn't violence, silence was." No one interrupted him this time, not even with concern. Concern had transformed into respect. The comments rolling on the livestream weren't a fan frenzy anymore. They were testimony. Stories of trainees who cried alone in practice rooms, of idols who smiled through contracts that drained them dry, of fans who felt gaslit by redemption arcs sold like packaged comebacks. The world was realizing something uncomfortable. HYBE didn't manufacture emotion. BTS did. HYBE didn't trend humanity. ARMY did. HYBE didn't build loyalty. The members bled for it personally. Then came the knock on the studio door. This time slower, respectful, intentional, not crisis-based. The door opened. Not by force, not by production, by permission finally being acknowledged. It was Bang Si-hyuk, Bangi Hayak in this narrative alias, stepping into a space he hadn't controlled. No entourage, no PR team, no scripted montage. Just a man who realized power sounded different when it had to knock first. Taehyung didn't stand. He didn't perform surprise either. He simply looked up, eyes tired but unshrinking now. "You came," he said quietly. "I knocked," Bangi replied. "That already changes the story." Taehyung scoffed under his breath. Jungkook didn't move from the railing. Namjoon didn't open his laptop again. No one offered Bangi a seat. He took one himself across from Taehyung, silence settling like dust that had finally stopped being swept under corporate rugs. "I built HYBE on resilience," Bangi said. "I forgot resilience still needs room to breathe." Taehyung nodded once, slow, intentional. Breathing isn't rebellion. Suffocating quietly was. Bangi exhaled, a mirror of the sigh the world had seen hours ago, but this one had no soundtrack behind it. "Do you still want to stay?" he asked. Taehyung met his eyes again. "I never wanted to leave BTS. I wanted BTS to stop losing pieces of itself silently to save a building." The December wind hummed louder outside the glass now, almost poetic but unedited. ARMY didn't want villains anymore. They wanted truth without post-production. They wanted BTS without censorship of emotional cost. They wanted Taehyung without mic-gripping backstage breakdowns. They wanted the version of their idol who spoke not because it paid, but because it healed a silence debt older than any contract signing ceremony. No press statement followed. No polished HYBE announcement. No media mediator stepping in to soften edges. The silence after the live stream ending became louder than the broadcast itself. It was a silence of consequence, not erasure. The kind that signals something structural is shifting beneath the surface. ARMY wasn't waiting for updates from news anchors or analysts anymore. They were creating the updates. Screenshots, translations, emotional threads, personal essays, fan art, long captions, raw reactions. Millions of people turning one rooftop moment into a public archive that no PR team could rewrite cleanly enough to neutralize. Taehyung stayed seated long after the broadcast ended, eyes tracing the skyline like someone trying to memorize the shape of a world before it changed permanently. Taehyung uncrossed his arms, finally standing and stretching his legs. Jungkook pushed off the railing, sitting on the opposite end of the couch now. Namjoon opened his laptop again, but not to draft talking points. He opened it to save a file. The live stream recording, not to edit, to preserve. The most dangerous document a corporation can face is not a contract clause. It's unedited truth saved by witnesses who refuse to let it disappear. Bangi Hayak sat in the room still, shoulders heavy now too, realizing that leadership delivered late still arrives heavier than leadership delivered wrong. "You said rip the contract," he murmured, repeating the words Taehyung had spoken into a phone earlier. "I said rip silence," Taehyung corrected gently. "Contracts can be rewritten. Silence buries people permanently." Bangi nodded slowly. "Then we rewrite both." The decision wasn't dramatic by volume, but by meaning. HYBE had always written the business story. BTS had always written the emotional one. For the first time, the emotional story forced the business story to rewrite itself around humanity instead of the other way around. The power shift wasn't a takeover. It was alignment finally being demanded by those who carried the emotional debt personally for years. Taehyung finally stood, legs stiff, voice soft but final. "I'm not asking HYBE to become a family. I'm asking HYBE to stop treating family like a marketing aesthetic." Jungkook smirked slightly. The first smile that didn't carry worry behind it. Taehyung finally sighed. "You sound like a man who survived the machine and came back bilingual in humanity." Namjoon tapped save on the file. "And the world will play this back for decades." Outside, December wind carried the city noise again, but softer now, almost as if the city was giving them permission to breathe without being clipped into villains or heroes. Just humans who built something massive and finally remembered to protect the foundations instead of just the skyscraper. Taehyung reached for the studio door, pausing only once more. "If BTS goes viral again," he said, "let it be for music, not because we finally stopped disappearing silently." He stepped out into the cold, and this time the cold didn't feel like a warning. It felt like open air finally returning after a decade of suffocation disguised as resilience. The weeks that followed felt less like a media cycle and more like a cultural echo that refused to fade. Every viral story eventually hits a decline, but this one lingered because it didn't behave like content. It behaved like proof that a single voice could shake an industry built on curated silence. Interviews were being requested globally, not for rehearsed heartbreak, but for the mechanics of truth itself. Commentators tried labeling it a turning point, a revolution, a crack in the corporate fourth wall, but ARMY called it something simpler: overdue oxygen finally reaching a room that had been sealed too long. Taehyung didn't attend any panels. He didn't schedule any redemption tour either. He returned to the only place that had ever made sense to him without translation: the studio. Not the rooftop one this time, but a familiar recording room where the walls smelled faintly of old vinyl, mic foam, and late-night creativity. The same kind of room he once thought he had to leave to save the group. Now the room he realized the group was built to protect in the first place. The irony didn't feel cruel anymore. It felt corrective. Jungkook in this narrative universe entered the studio carrying iced Americanos, setting one beside Taehyung without ceremony. Taehyung arrived minutes later, dropping a small box of tissues near the audio console like a peace offering to emotion itself. Namjoon followed last, laptop open but posture calm, because leadership had stopped sounding like fire drills and started sounding like awareness drills. No one said handled anymore. They said here. And here became the new policy. Taehyung adjusted the mic height himself, leaning in slightly, voice finally carrying that blend ARMY had always loved: warm, sincere, immersive, steady. "I'm grateful for HYBA," he said into the mic. "Not for broadcast, not for shareholders, just for archival clarity. But I'll never again be grateful quietly at the expense of disappearing pieces of myself." The men around him nodded, not for cameras, but because they finally understood that gratitude without room to breathe becomes debt, and debt eventually cries louder than fandom ever shouts. He pressed record. The waveform began forming on the monitor, peaks and valleys drawn by intention, not crisis. Music returned as the main character, not heartbreak, not conglomerates, not apologies, just sound built to heal, not to defend. The studio door stayed unlocked now too, symbolic not because it needed to be open, but because it had stopped needing to hide anything behind it. ARMY continued to mobilize in their own ways, streaming music harder than narratives, defending humanity louder than analysts, building community threads longer than any 10,000-character segment could capture. But the core of the story had already reached its final arc quietly in an unlocked studio, where one idol stopped being edited out of rooms that mattered. Taehyung leaned back in the chair, headphones resting around his neck like a crown made of purpose instead of pressure. "If BTS trends again," he said softly, "let it be because we chose to be heard, not because we finally fought to exist." Outside, Seoul winter carried on as winter does: cold, neutral, honest, unstyled, indifferent to optics, generous with open air. The aftermath wasn't instantaneous applause or corporate concession. It was quieter, subtler, and more enduring. HYBE's internal memos circulated. Legal teams scuttled behind closed doors, PR strategies were redrafted, and boardrooms reevaluated hierarchies. But the real impact was measured elsewhere, in hotel rooms, dorms, practice studios, and living rooms around the globe. ARMY didn't wait for approval. They held the conversation, replayed the rooftop livestream, and dissected every word for meaning and honesty. They weren't just fans anymore, they were witnesses. Taehyung returned to his routines carefully, not because anything had gone back to normal, but because normalcy was redefined. He walked into rehearsal rooms without hesitation, aware of the cameras but aware of himself even more. No forced smiles, no muted expressions of tension. Each note he sang, each dance he practiced, became an act of reclamation. It wasn't about proving HYBE wrong. It was about proving that the person beneath the label could persist and thrive without erasure. The members gathered in the dorm rarely discussed the broadcast explicitly, but the energy was transformed. Jungkook, Namjoon, Hobi, Taehyung, Jungkook, and Jin all understood deeply that boundaries had shifted, not just for Taehyung but for all of them. Meetings were no longer opportunities for silent compliance. Discussions were intentional, honest, and layered with a respect that had been buried under years of protocol. Loyalty was recalibrated from fear-based compliance to choice-driven unity. HYBE's social channels went silent initially, then cautiously active. They didn't know how to narrate this story without seeming performative. Analysts debated, competitors watched, and fans were already in the streets of cyberspace, a collective heartbeat streaming live across every platform. Yet, inside the private rooms of the rooftop studio and the old Hanok hideaway, the narrative had already been claimed. Taehyung and the members weren't waiting for permission. They were creating their own space, unfiltered, unedited, undeniably present. The press began catching fragments. Legal murmurs leaked carefully curated pieces, but nothing could overwrite the live stream, the rooftop confessions, or the clarity with which Taehyung had spoken. He hadn't raised his voice to be heard over executives. He had spoken to be seen by everyone who had ever felt muted, erased, or minimized. And that vision didn't disappear once the cameras stopped rolling. It persisted in the way BTS walked together, moved together, and even in the quiet nods shared between members who had finally seen each other in full. Taehyung spent the evening alone briefly, standing by the studio window, letting the city lights reflect in his eyes. The calm was fragile, but it was real. For the first time in years, he measured his days not by deadlines, ratings, or market expectations, but by what he could create without compromising his voice. The music that came next was cleaner, warmer, and richer because it carried the weight of truth, not the chains of silence. And somewhere beyond the cityscape, ARMY continued to trend not headlines but empathy, not scandal but courage, not isolation but connection. Taehyung had lit a spark, but it was the millions of hearts watching, listening, and believing that fanned it into a flame. It wasn't a viral moment. It was a movement, a quiet insistence that being seen mattered more than being silenced. The screens could scroll, the world could comment, and HYBE could maneuver its corporate chess. But no strategy could erase the truth of what had been spoken aloud in real time.